Hey nerds, what's up? So this video started in a very different direction than where we're going to end up today. Originally, I was looking into this idea that morally gray characters are on the rise. This idea I've seen parroted a lot in various ways in forums in the fantasy genre over the last few years, and it seems that people are constantly saying like, oh, people don't like the classic good versus evil anymore in their stories. It all has to be morally gray. However, as I continue to research deeper into this topic, I found that morally gray has now become conflated with grimdark, and they're so tied together that they're often hard to separate. So today, follow me on a journey as we talk about what morally gray even is, how morally gray ended up becoming tied to grimdark, and an overall discussion on the fantasy genre, fantasy trends, and what the future looks like for our genre. See you after the jump. Okay, I know you guys are probably really tired of me starting every video I make with a definition section, but guys, this is important. I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult to have these morally gray conversations is that we never really define what we individually mean by morally gray, and there's a big spectrum of what people mean when they talk about that. For example, is there a difference between morally gray, the anti-hero, a sympathetic villain, a villain protagonist, or a redeemed villain? These have a lot of overlap, and I think that's what makes the discussion very difficult. Morally gray in general is considered to be if a character does too many good things to be considered a bad person, but too many bad things to be considered a good person. But sometimes people talk about it being a character who does bad things to achieve a good cause, but that kind of gets into anti-hero territory, or some people say it's just a character that works a little bit too much in self-interest. But what about the sympathetic villain or the villain protagonist? In the case of a sympathetic villain, it's usually because of their backstory gives understanding to their behavior, but a villain protagonist can be a little different in that because we see through their eyes, we kind of root for them no matter what, even if we can recognize they're the villain. I think it's easy to see how these can all be interconnected, and so when we talk about morally gray, we're really talking about a vast number of things. It's a big umbrella. And thus, my research has led me to the brave and maybe controversial opinion that there has not been a rise in morally gray characters. We have always had morally gray characters. I just think there has been a rise in us talking about characters in those specific terms, and there's been a rise in the acceptance of more explicit content, which may lead to the perception that morally gray characters are more in demand or more created over time. In reality, I think we've been seeing these characters for a long time, and as many other tropes and definitions I talk about may have been overused to the point where it's just lost a little bit of meaning. I want to address my second point briefly before we really get into the history of morally gray characters. I think that morally gray gets bundled with grimdark often incorrectly. You can have morally gray characters in a book or a show or a media that isn't grimdark, and also you can have a grimdark novel that isn't really explicit. In a lot of ways, I think what we're really seeing maybe is a rise of grimdark rather than a rise of morally gray characters, but again, because we've tended to lump those together, we think they're the same thing. Let's dive into some examples. I want to start with a very famous rogue, that of our very own Han Solo. Now, by the standards we use today, people would probably balk at calling him a morally gray character. Yet, compared to Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia, our other squeaky clean protagonists, Solo is the smuggler with a heart of gold, the person who says he's going to leave, is selfish, says he's not going to be involved in the rebellion, but ultimately has a change of heart. What about Severus Snape, the character that brought morally gray to our youngest readers? To be honest, I think this is why so many readers struggle with where to put Severus Snape, because it's often their first experience with a truly morally gray character, but that's a discussion for another video. Severus Snape, a former Death Eater who only changed his ways when he didn't get what he wanted, relentlessly bullied his students in absolutely inappropriate ways, relished in the potential death of an innocent, albeit rude classmate, yet ultimately sacrificed himself in every possible way for the greater good. Morally gray can also come in to play with villains, and I think especially child villains, because we tend to view child antagonists as having more room to grow because after all, they're just children. Two popular and well-known characters I can think of that follow this is Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender and Draco Malfoy from Harry Potter. Both are clearly antagonists to our main heroes, but both are clearly struggling internally. Zuko particularly is such a compelling villain to the point where I think his story arc was probably one of the most interesting of the show for me personally, and one of the characters I was rooting the most for. Now, when we compare this to the morally gray characters we see in, say, Game of Thrones, Mr. Solo and Snape may feel very tame by comparison. But that's where I think we get into this explicit territory. Now, I've said many times on my channel, I have not watched nor read Game of Thrones, so I had to rely on some of my friends who are Game of Thrones experts to help me out here. And they agreed with what I had to say, which is, I don't necessarily think the characters in Game of Thrones are that much more morally gray than the other characters I've talked about. The difference is that the book is just way more explicit, and it's grimdark. There's a hopelessness to a lot of the characters that makes it feel worse. But again, morally gray and grimdark and explicit are three separate categories that I think we lump together. As another last example, are Andor and Han Solo really that different when we boil it down? Or does Andor just feel more gritty, and so Cassian feels like he's a more morally gray character? It's important to note here, Star Wars and Harry Potter are neither grimdark nor explicit, so the morally gray characters may feel less morally gray. Now, there's nothing wrong with conflating these, I guess, if that's kind of the new definition. But if we're trying to talk about fantasy trends and whether or not morally gray is more popular and pure good and evil isn't, we need to be able to separate this out from each other to really understand where and why the trend started and what the trend even is. And thus we get to the real heart of the question, which is grimdark rising in popularity? Is that the trend we are seeing right now? Because I think that's the real question and not the morally gray characters. I really think morally gray characters have been around since the dawn of time. First, the term grimdark is actually a relatively new term, which probably points to the fact that it is a newer trend if we had to define a word for it. Now, of course, just because there wasn't a label for it doesn't mean it wasn't being written, obviously. But again, the need for a label necessitates that enough is being written or it's being looked after enough that we needed to lump it together. The term was actually coined from the tagline of the very, very popular tabletop game Warhammer 40K. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Grim darkness, grimdark. Now, according to my research, the term grimdark showed up first on the internet around 2008, where it was used here and there. And that was so much later than I expected. It really surprised me. So I want to look at a little timeline to help put things into perspective. Now, the books I've chosen are really like looking at the most popular grimdark books and trying to go back far, and it really just didn't go back as far as I expected. So let's dive into the timeline. So the first really book that people are still labeling as grimdark was in 1984 with The Black Company by Glenn Cook. Then in 1987, Warhammer 40K was first published. In 1993, The Last Wish was published. In 1995, Assassin's Apprentice. In 1996, A Game of Thrones was published. In 1999, Gardens of the Moon was published. Then in 2006, The Blade itself was published. Then in 2008 is when the term grimdark was coined, supposedly. Obviously, this is very hard to pinpoint. Then in 2011, we had the Game of Thrones Season 1 airing and The Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence published. In 2013, I think is the first time that Joe Abercrombie used the term Lord Grimdark. I'm relying on my friend Leanna from Leanna's Library, who is a Joe Abercrombie stan. She says she thinks that's about the time it was first used. I could not find the tweet. In 2014, Grimdark Magazine first began, and then in 2019, we had our final season of the Game of Thrones. I also think it's interesting to look at this Google Trends of the terms grimdark and a huge rise we can see between 2004 and now. I think that's also very telling. Now, a lot of people have credited Game of Thrones to being the reason there is a rise of grimdark, and looking at this timeline, I don't think that's necessarily wrong, right? Game of Thrones, the TV show, became such a sensation. It was inescapable. Everyone was watching it. Even my friends who wanted nothing to do with fantasy were watching Game of Thrones. And that kind of popularity is going to put eyes on the type of thing it is. There's always going to be copycats and people looking for a similar thing. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, Game of Thrones averaged 46 million viewers in its final season. The final episode broke viewership records, bringing in 19.8 million viewers as it aired. That's insanity. Sure, was it the first? Based on our timeline, probably not. But the first never has to be the thing that makes something rise in popularity. It's just what catches on. So when we look at when our modern term of grimdark was coined and the timeline, I think it's reasonable to make the statement that Game of Thrones was a huge pivotal factor in the rise of grimdark. Ultimately, I think trends are just very difficult to see while you're in them and are much easier to view on hindsight. There have been a lot of fantasy trends in the past. I think one of the most famous ones is Tolkien and his influence on fantasy for a big chunk of time. And though I think he still influences fantasy, there was definitely a specific amount of time where it was like a very direct influence, and it's easier for us to see that now that we have some distance from it. Other trends I've been noticing that are on the rise, like grimdark recently, but are pretty new, so I can't say if they're going to be long-lasting or small trends, are things like rejecting classic medieval Europe as a fantasy setting, stories that revolve around more inclusive protagonists, and most recently, a small rise in what we call cozy fantasy. It is interesting if that last one is maybe rising as a response to the grimdark trend, or is only something that is passing in the night. Again, only time will tell. So, do I think grimdark is a trend? Yeah, I do. Looking at that timeline and the popularity of Game of Thrones, I think we are looking at more grimdark novels, but not necessarily more morally gray characters. And ultimately, when we look at all of the best-selling books currently right now, we see that there is room for a lot of different kinds of fantasy. And honestly, I think some staples of the fantasy genre will just always be popular and never leave the zeitgeist. Now, here's a call to action. If one of my followers or watchers of this video is more historically minded than I am, which I'm not, like history was my least favorite subject in school, tell me, could you chart fantasy trends with history? Are there direct responses of things that are going on historically, and so our fantasy trends are a response to that? Now, I already know the answer is yes in some cases, like just when I look at Tolkien fantasy and what rose out of that. But in more modern times, could you chart public perception or wars or something like that with a rise in a certain fantasy trend? Let me know. I'd love to hear the research. Okay, thanks for going on this journey with me. I know this is kind of niche, but I love understanding our genre just a little more, and I also love trying to at least challenge a lot of things that are repeated a lot. I am on Reddit, and this idea of like morally gray is more popular and no one likes pure good and evil, and that's what's on the rise is like a very common parroted thing. I would like to know if you've come across that. Like, is this the first time you're hearing that, or you're like, yes, I've heard that all the time? Anyway, conclusions. From my research, this is my statements. Morally gray is not on the rise. We've always had morally gray. Morally gray is very common, even in classic good versus evil fantasy. I do think there has been a rise of grimdark, and I do think because over time books and TV have been able to be more explicit, that may make things feel darker. And I think that there's just a lot at play. I do think we're kind of in a grimdark section right now. I am curious to see if that is on the lowdown as other things go up. You guys let me know. Do you care about fantasy trends? Does it ever influence what you read? What do you think about these timelines? Do you have anything to add? Please let me know in the comments. I love hearing from you. And as always, if you like these kind of deep dives, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.